Greetings, fellow humans, and welcome to the book Wormhole. There was a part in the beginning of last month where I was so on top of things and writing my script as I finished my books, possibly because the first book I read this month took me 2 weeks to get through, and then I sped read 4 books at the end of the month. But despite being late, I had another good reading month full of books I really enjoyed. The first book was The City of Illusions by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a science fiction which can be read as a standalone, but it is also part of Le Guin's Hainish cycle. Falk, a human-like man with slitted yellow eyes like a cat, wakes up in the forest with no memory of where he came from and reduced back to the mind of a baby. He is taken in by a family and rehabilitated, all the while learning their culture, which fears a group of aliens called the Shing, who now control Earth and hinder civilization from developing to be any larger than scattered small groups of people across the planet. The Shing are most notable for being liars, something Falk is warned about throughout the book. Once Falk gets back on his feet, he leaves the family to travel across the world and to seek out the Shing in order to receive the answers that were stolen from him. I buddy read this with Joan from The Rabbit Hole, but we decided against doing a live show discussion of it as we both felt there wasn't much to discuss. The first 80 pages were kind of a slog, mostly because it was Falk traveling alone through nature. I did like the isolation of this part of the book, especially to show what Le Guin was saying about how the Shing's presence has hindered Earth's development, but overall nothing of great significance happens in this part of the book. Once Falk gets captured by a hostile group of humans, he meets a slave woman whom he plots his escape with in exchange for her guiding him to the Shing, and the book gets a little more interesting, particularly when something Strella, the slave woman, says suggests that the reason Falk is stripped of his memory might be because that is how the Shing punish criminals, which made me wonder if Falk is really the good guy after all. However, it isn't until Falk reaches the City of Illusion that the story reaches its full potential and lives up to its name, as deceptions are uncovered and more information is revealed to Falk, not knowing what is true and what is false, including everything he has experienced up until this point. He's unable to trust the Shing and unsure if they have ulterior motives. I had a lot of fun during these chapters. Things would be revealed and then quickly disproved. It made for this really exciting read where I wasn't sure what was going to happen next because I barely knew what was the truth. Overall, I'm glad I read this because I've been wanting to read more in the Hainish cycle after reading Left Hand of Darkness, even though the books aren't really too connected with each other, nor do you have to read them in order to understand the story, as it's just different stories happen in different locations of the same universe. I do hope to continue to read other books in the series, but I also felt like this book in particular could have achieved the same thing in a short story version, as it felt longer than it needed to be, and particularly empty at the beginning. I debated pretty much all month of what to rate this book, and I've decided on 3 stars because I know Le Guin is better than this book. The next 2 books I read were both part of the Animorphs series. First one I read was The Capture, and this is book 6. This is a series in which a group of kids obtain the power to morph into animals in order to help fight back against invading brain slug aliens called the Yeerks, who seek to enslave all humans. Honestly, there's not too much I'm going to say about this one. I find it hard to talk about books in a series without giving away spoilers for earlier books, so here's just some general thoughts I had after continuing on in this series after being away from it for almost a year. Last time I read an Animorphs was last March. Because it's been long enough, I was a little more grateful for the redundant explanations in the book, but I do think that is what is going to keep me from reading these books back to back like I was doing last time. But this reminded me why Animorphs have stuck with me since I first read it back in 3rd grade, and stuck with me enough that I want to reread and finish the series as an adult. It's a series that treats its reader, namely young kids who it's aimed towards, with respect. It's not trying to be overly edgy, but nor is it pulling punches, particularly when it comes to the reality of the situation. In book 1, main character Jake learns his brother has become controlled by a Yeerk, In this book, most of Jake's personal plot revolves around his fears of what it means to be actively fighting against the Yeerks while his brother is under their control. His worries include everything from having to possibly kill his brother or be killed by him, to possibly getting his brother killed by Visor 3, the leader of the Yeerks, should Jake sabotage the Yeerks' invasion in a way that suggests his brother has failed them. I love how reasonable and complex these concerns are and how it presents the story with unique challenges for the characters to overcome. I love the way stakes were raised in this book. It was both unexpected as well as kept me on my toes to how this new problem would be resolved, and also if it would be resolved at all, since permanent consequences have already happened in this series right off the bat. That is, Tobias being stuck in a hawk body at the end of book 1 and still remains a hawk as the series continues. I read the entirety of this book in one day. It's probably one of my favorite in this series so far, 5 stars for sure. In Animorphs the Stranger, we follow Rachel, Jake's cousin and fellow Animorph instead. Again, the redundancy and explanations made this hard to get through the introductory chapters because I already know most of this information and just want to skip it to get to the main plot. But the recap is always tied into the first chapters, so I can't just skip it. I remember really liking Rachel as a character as a child, since she is the first time I've seen a female character be able to be pretty and interested in traditionally female interests, such as fashion, while also being the tough and brave character of the group. And I like that this role burdens her, particularly in this book. On the exterior, she is brave and always willing to fight for what's right, but inside she has her doubts and she's deeply afraid, but feels like she has to put on this tough face for her friends as they continue to fight this really scary, mature war that is way above their heads. When a new type of alien is introduced in this book, I had my doubts because this new alien felt a little too overpowerful, and it was the first time in this series where this war felt unevenly balanced in favor of our heroes. That's another thing I like about this series, is that I like that it doesn't feel like the humans are guaranteed success, and these kids really struggle every book, which makes it have this genuine suspense. However, it was cool once it was revealed that this overly powerful alien isn't allowed to intervene on galactic matters, and instead his role is to pose as a choice to the Animorphs that perfectly mirrors Rachel's personal plot in this book. And that, without giving too much of the plot away, is generally either choosing to continue to fight this war that doesn't look like they're going to win, or choosing to run away from these problems, at a great sacrifice to humanity. But their personal lives would be better, albeit choosing to live in ignorance. So I thought that theme was both unique compared to the plots of previous books, and asked a pretty meaningful question. However, compared to the other books in this series, this book was good. It wasn't my least favorite, but I definitely didn't feel the same amount of enthusiasm as I did with the previous one, so I rated this one 4 stars. The Ones We're Meant to Find by Joan. This is a young adult science fiction. In a climate-ruined future, Casey lives in a floating eco-city, safe from the world below. Months ago, her sister Celia took a boat out to sea and hasn't returned. Though presumed dead, Casey retraces her sister's final moments in the city before her disappearances in order to find some answers. Meanwhile, a girl named C is stranded on an abandoned island without memory of how she got there. The only thing she knows is that she has a sister named Kay, and that she must cross the ocean to return to her. First off, the sci-fi elements of this book were absolutely spectacular. I haven't read much climate science fiction, but this one really embraces many of the issues we are starting to face today, and taking it to irreversible extremes. It felt horrifically believable, and while loaning a lot to the setting, I like that it also plays a large role in the conflicts of this book as well. I love the concept of eco-city in this book. It walks a tightrope between being something from a solar punk book and being a dystopia. Residents are given a rank directly related to the ecological impact. The lower the number, the more eco-friendly the lifestyle you live, and therefore the more privileges you have in society. People with too high of numbers aren't allowed to live in the eco-cities, fully exposed to the horrors of climate change. And these numbers factor in lineage. That is, if you so happen to be a descendant of a big oil company, that would severely impact your rank from birth. Casey has one of the lowest ranks in the city, but largely because her parents so happen to be two of the top scientists who have worked to create the eco-cities. So even she was more or less born into privilege rather than earning it, like the system suggests it actually works. Most of life in the eco-city is lived through virtual reality to minimize environmental impacts, and this is something that is viewed as both a positive and a negative thing by characters. It also felt familiar to what we've been experiencing with COVID, both as in how events have changed to accommodate social distancing and instead going virtual, as well as how people have fought against these changes. Chapters alternate between Casey's and C's POV and between their two storylines. C's chapters have a much different tone and overall lack of technology while being immersed in nature imagery. I love the mystery carried throughout in these chapters. Just like C doesn't know who she is or how she got to the island, we as readers are also left speculating the reality of her situation, as things are just slightly off to hint that there's more going on here than what we are able to understand at the moment. The ending, without giving too much away, ends in a cliffhanger. A choice needs to be made and the book ends before we see what decision the main character comes to. Initially, I was kind of peeved, but then I realized that that's not the point of this book, and that's not what this book is supposed to be about. The decision ultimately doesn't matter, it's everything else that does, and once I realized that, I ended up loving it. I enjoyed this book a lot, though for a good portion of it, I didn't know what was going on, but that felt intentional on Hay's part. I love the question Hay asked through the story, and I'm kind of surprised this is being marketed as a young adult because it doesn't really feel like one besides the fact the main characters are 16 and 18. It definitely felt more on the nebulous side, which is why I personally liked it. This book was 5 stars for sure. Displacement by Kiku Hughes. This is a science fiction graphic novel. While visiting her late grandma's birthplace in San Francisco, teenage Kiku is suddenly swept into the past, witnessing firsthand her grandmother's experiences as a young girl during World War II, being incarcerated in a Japanese internment camp. Part of what initially drew me to this book is the historical setting. Japanese internment camps were something history classes I've taken only briefly touched on, but that's public school, am I right? And it's something that's still relevant with what is still going on today in border detention camps. The book even makes this comparison with newsreels of the 2016 election playing in the background. And later in the book, Kiku's experiences in the internment camp inspires her to protest against modern mistreatment of another minority and serves as a call to action for readers alike. This book is a great learning tool as well as a story that is obviously deeply personal to the author, but I think it balances being both of these things well. The main character Kiku is based off of the author Kiku Hughes, and her desire to know her grandmother, who passed before Kiku was born. Her grandmother's experiences during World War II are something her mother never talks about, and nor does Kiku want to ask about because talking about her late grandmother makes her mother sad. Let alone it is a very uncomfortable subject despite being an important one, and I can only imagine a lot of descendants of the people who lived through the internment camps probably feel a similar way. The book discusses the concept of the model minority and how many incarcerated Japanese Americans went on to have successful lives despite the horrific thing that was done to them. This has been used as both a way to oppress other minorities by comparing the rebellion to how compliant the Japanese Americans were and how it all ended up working out for them in the end. Allegedly. But also it's a double-edged blade as it also works to silence any Japanese Americans that would want to speak out against these injustices. While Kiku's grandmother remains present throughout the book, Kiku never actually talks or interacts with her directly. Something I didn't expect, but I enjoyed nonetheless, and I think it was the right choice for the story. While author Hughes has put herself and her family into the story, I can understand why she would want to limit her late grandmother's appearances to what she knows for sure, rather than speculating how a conversation between them might go. It feels like a choice done out of respect. Her grandmother's a real person, not a character to play around with, and unlike herself or her mother, her grandmother isn't around to consent to her depiction. So it makes sense, and I think it also encourages this idea that just because a family member isn't around anymore doesn't mean that their presence is gone, or you can't come to understand them. I think my favorite part was the No-No Boys, something I remember learning about, but I don't think I ever really fully grasped until I read this book, and I love the way it was handled. A survey was conducted for all incarcerated Japanese Americans, and 2 of the questions were, do you reject your home country, Japan? A really bizarre thing to ask of folks who were, for the most part, born in America, and would you serve the US Army? The survey was mostly symbolic, but for those who answered no, there were consequences, as well as they were kind of shunned by other prisoners. Needless to say, answering no was a huge political statement and an act of rebellion. When Kiku is posed with these questions, she feels torn, but ends up answering yes to both, as a way to protect herself. What follows is a great conversation she has with another prisoner who has openly rebelled since the moment she was forced into camp. She understands Kiku's decision and doesn't criticize her for it, unlike Kiku expects, and explains that they all show resistance in their own way. I really love that because I think we get stuck on one mental idea of what resistance looks like, and then end up shaming anyone else who appears to be compliant in their oppression because they don't match up with that image. When resistance against oppression is a complex and not always straightforward thing. I like the lesbian relationship subplot. Kiku forms friendships and bonds with other people in the camp, and once ends up developing into a relationship with another girl. For such a subtle detail, it highlights that LGBT people have always existed in history. Honestly, I'm amazed at how much was in this book. I didn't even cover everything this book covers. It's so complex. It's a really great learning tool. I hope schools adapt into the curriculum, and it balances being a very personal tale as well. It made me angry at points at the unjust treatments and sad at other points, and even sometimes encouraged. 5 stars. The Man Who Folded Himself by David Gerrold. This is a science fiction. After his uncle's passing, Dan is gifted in his will a peculiar belt that allows him to time travel. During the first use of the belt, Dan travels into the future in order to procure a newspaper with the names of the winning racehorses to bring back to his time. But once he arrives, he finds a future version of himself waiting for him. Dan quickly falls into the habit of hanging out with different versions of himself from different timelines. Sometimes future versions of himself coming back in time to warn him about his actions, and sometimes he is the future version going back to help a past self. Despite being the second time travel book I read this month, I usually find it hard to get interested in time travel stories. I think because there's always these common tropes / rules that aren't very interesting to me, such as not being able to alter the past, even in minor ways, and not being able to interact with past versions of yourself. This book just gives a big middle finger to both of those ideas and allows the protagonist to truly play around with the concept of time travel, and I loved it. I absolutely devoured this book. I could not put it down. The concept of spending time with different versions of yourself and having this protective relationship over past selves versus vulnerable but admiring future versions of yourself was so incredibly beautiful. I think already as a non-time traveling individual, this is something we can practice ourselves with being forgiven towards our past selves and taking actions now to care for our future selves. It's the same thing I really enjoy in science fictions with clones, those sort of stories about self-love and self-sacrifice but embodied in 2 carbon-copied individuals. This book also explores sexuality in a really beautiful and complex way I've yet to see done in another novel. It's hard to imagine a book like this being written today, and even more incredible that it was originally published in 1973. It was so ahead of its time. Honestly, there's not much else I can say about this one without giving it away, but I feel like this is a really underrated classic that holds up amazingly well, and I couldn't have read it at a better time because it really reminded me to be kind to myself. Absolutely a 5-star read. Several People Are Typing by Kasulke. This is a contemporary with light sci-fi elements. In a freak accident, Gerrold accidentally uploads his mind to the company's Slack server while working from home, leaving his body an absent husk back in his apartment. Gerrold is suddenly able to view all of his coworkers' private messages, and his main company is Slackbot. Gerrold soon realizes he might not want to return to his body after all. I did a reading vlog of this book earlier this month, so I'm going to keep this brief since a lot of it I had said before in that video. This book is written in a series of instant messages, which makes it a very quick read. The concept is kinda silly and characters recognize this, believing for a portion of this story that Gerrold is pulling an elaborate prank rather than actually being stuck in the server. Overall, the book isn't too serious while also managing to have reasonably high stakes, and the humor works. Friendships come across as friendships with all the inside jokes that comes with, as well as there's some added surreal humor to the world of this book that I just really enjoy because it reminds me of the same surreal humor of Welcome to Night Vale. In my reading vlog, I compared this to Discord because that is the instant messenger I'm more familiar with, and I entirely forgot that Slack is a similar program that does actually exist, but the writing captures both the limitations and the capabilities of instant message, Discord / Slack conversation well, which I always enjoy reading something in a unique style like that. The downside of this though is that characters felt underdeveloped because all we could learn about them, we learned through conversation, and I also worry this book might become quickly outdated within a decade because it is so reliant on current culture. Overall, this is a fun book that is very worth reading, and I gave it 4 stars. This is the most books I've read in a month since last March, and not only that, but I've managed to read 2 classics / older sci-fis, which is double my monthly goal of reading 1, and read 2 more in the Animorphs series, which I had hoped to read at least 1 this year, so I'm well on track with my reading goals for this year, and I'm very pleased. Let me know how your month went, if you've read any of these books I've mentioned, and what you think. Next month I'll be doing a buddy read of Do You Dream of Terror 2 by Temi O with Annie from Annie's Book Nook. Make sure you give her channel a follow as it's listed in the description below. I've already started the book and it's been enjoyable so far, and it's going to be a fun one to discuss. Thanks for watching. As always, please support your local library and shop independent when you can. Until next time, please stay tuned.